Hello, and a warm welcome to this introductory segment of what is initially a 7-part series of presentations, podcasts, public lectures, call them what you will, on paid sexual services in Canada. A few days ago, the Conservative government of Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper tabled legislation intended to criminalize the purchase of sexual services, legislation known as Bill C36. This proposed legislation is certainly the immediate motivation for this series of talks. However, many of my comments are more general, and I would hope relevant to similar ongoing debates in other parts of the world. I'll use this segment to outline the series, its goals, introduce myself, establish some essential context, and lay down a few key touchstones that will anchor our analysis in the later segments. Difficult as it is to remember at this moment, we're now 50 years into a sexual revolution that has distinguished sex from procreation and affirmed the erotic aspect of life as a matter of individual taste and choice. Sometimes it seems that for every major social action, there's a significant reaction, and certainly we've seen in recent decades that the increased visibility of a wide spectrum of lifestyles, identities, and services has brought these at times into conflict with devotees of traditional attitudes and belief systems. Sexual liberation has often been followed by a powerful, albeit sometimes transitory, political backlash. And now, in Canada, the government proposes to use the police, the courts, and the penal system to regulate casual sex, and specifically paid sexual services. If we think about the sexual revolution as a collection of interrelated demographic, social, and technological changes, one pattern we've seen is a dual dynamic of progress on the one hand, and backlash and retrenchment on the other. To cite just two examples, one of them perhaps more familiar to audience members in the developed world, the U.S. government's emancipated gays and lesbians beginning in the 1970s. As the firings of gay employees stopped and many states' sodomy laws were gradually dropped in the 2 decades following 1970, social conservatives took a desperate last stand with the Defense of Marriage Act in 1996 and various state-level constitutional bans on same-sex marriage. Further afield, in Nigeria, a rapidly urbanizing country in Africa, a law was enacted in January of this year that makes it illegal, quote, not only to engage in an intimate same-sex relationship with a member of the same sex, but to attend or organize a meeting of gays or patronize or operate any type of gay organization. In both cases, a moral panic has captured government policymaking following the partial relaxation of previously oppressive conditions. In Canada, the order paper at first reading told the story. This was to be, quote, an act to amend the criminal code in response to the Supreme Court of Canada decision in Attorney General of Canada versus Bedford. And indeed, this is reaction at its bluntest. In recent years, the increased ease of conducting business in private locations with the benefit of online advertising, together with several fundamental attitudinal changes in society, has arguably led during the last decade to a flourishing of sexual services and also to the possibility of Canadian courts categorically throwing out virtually all existing legislation in Canada concerning sexual services. This confluence of circumstances, together with the presence of a government with a base in socially conservative constituencies, has created a perfect storm for a regressive and reactionary initiative to try very hard to put the genie back into the bottle with the help of the police and prisons. The proposed legislation proposes to convict and punish, quote, everyone who in any place obtains for consideration or communicates with anyone for the purpose of obtaining for consideration the sexual services of a person. The legislation also prohibits most notably the mere advertisement, including, incredibly, online advertisement of sexual services. And with this, the government has made known its intentions of intervening in the private, largely unseen sexual lives of Canadians, to go back into the bedrooms of the nation. We desperately need to talk. Many of us, including myself, would otherwise be more than content to remain silent and let the courts uphold the Canadian Charter through the course of a rights-based legal challenge. However, unfortunately, it's now urgent that we rise to the occasion, because in the modern age, political influence depends upon affected groups organizing and mobilizing. And the issue of paid sexual services is a particularly tough one for modern liberal democracies to get right. It could be years before the courts get this dog to heel, and in the meantime, there's the potential for thousands of lives to be ruined, with sex workers forced into dark alleys, armed police running into bedrooms, public shamings, suicides, the whole 9 yards. Now is absolutely the time for well-educated and informed professional clients to participate and to provide some perspective on a debate that sometimes seems to run right off the rails of evidence-based, reasoned discourse. So if you're among the tens of thousands of doctors, lawyers, judges, social workers, consultants, academics, and other informed citizens who are clients of sex workers and can read and fog a mirror, I hope you'll join me in stepping up and taking a thoughtful and systematic look at this subject. As a society, we need to have this discussion, and we cannot have it with clients remaining silent. This may well be your political issue of a lifetime, as I feel it is for me. If you're a sex worker, I feel your pain. This is a direct frontal attack on your personal security, your livelihood, your choices, your way of life. And I, for one, am going to make at least a modest effort with this series to lend a hand. I just hope it's useful. The issue of paid sexual services engages with numerous aspects, particularly in the realm of public policy. My intention in this series is to frame up as quickly as possible a set of themes that I can see are important, and to piece together a few key sources for each of them. Many of these sources I've encountered for the first time in the course of preparing these materials. Producing this series has certainly stretched my time, given the urgency of completing it quickly, and given the multidisciplinary nature of the issues that require discussion. What I'm attempting to provide you with here is basically a source book, a reader, with a limited layer of analysis and commentary added on top. In a few cases, I'll try to extend some raw materials and even some data to stimulate a broader public engagement with these issues than the extremely limited one that it has been conducted to date. I'm not an academic, much less a specialist in any of the related fields. However, even I, as an experienced client and a business consultant in my professional life, can see that there are some crucial missing pieces of data, not just in Canada, but globally. And so in part 5, I'll digress briefly to propose a multi-factor model and multi-site longitudinal research design that should be refined, then funded, approved, and completed over the next decade or so while Western democracies are grappling with these issues. Also, for part 4, I acquired and crunched some publicly available data on sexual proclivities in relation to gender from a massive, well-known government-funded U.S. survey. All of this is very much a first coat of paint that will benefit greatly from your amplifications, corrections, and contributions. This is not primarily a polemical work. In my opinion, the weight of both empirically grounded and theoretically aware views on this issue falls so heavily on one side, and specifically against the proposed Canadian legislation, that we should try to stay focused on the facts. There is an aspect of a modern-day moral crusade with this issue. But rather than responding in kind to that, we need to be the voice of evidence-based policy and enlightened reason. That said, we will certainly not refrain from noting, in the clearest of terms, the dismal failure to date of the Canadian political elite on this subject. I've produced this series of contributions on my own, as a sort of pro bono consulting project with, in my fond imagination, my country as my client. I've exploited a short lull in my professional workload, and so have devoted as much time during the past few weeks as I could spare. I'm not in communication with other clients, but I hope that others will argue their points of view in their own manner, whether or not they agree with mine. I would describe myself as a middle-aged entrepreneur in information technology with a full head of hair. A frequent and grateful client, I'm a white, economically privileged, highly educated, interested and non-neutral party to this issue. I hope you'll like me anyway. And more importantly, find this series informative as you seek out your own position on this important issue. Unlike many others participating in the debate in Canada, I've met and conversed with many dozens of women who work in this field. I'm just one among tens or hundreds of thousands of clients in Canada. But based on everything I've been exposed to, I believe that sex, including casual sex, is primarily a powerful force for the good in our lives and in our society. I believe that clients have a legitimate interest in this political debate and can contribute one relevant set of voices. And most importantly, I believe that the legal rights at stake attach primarily to sex workers, and the concern for their well-being properly forms the ethical core of this issue. It is tempting, particularly for anyone with limited or no direct personal experience, to attempt to conjure up a singular, monolithic representation of sex work. What the women are like, their circumstances, their experiences, their degree of exploitation, objectification, degradation, commodification, etc., etc. And yet such a perspective would be almost as limited as a plain vanilla view of modern human sexuality masquerading as a full account. The diagram on this slide, which you may have previously seen, notes the multiplicity of modern forms of non-monogamous sexual relationships. A further useful analogy would be to try to represent the pursuit of the visual arts, economically another part of the informal sector, as a uniform activity. One could reductively construe the undertaking of painting on canvas by artists as a service that involves applying substances to surfaces for financial consideration. And further, even if we've never met a real, actual artist, we could fill in the blanks with our imaginations from the outside as to what their situation in life must be like. Painters must be working in terrible isolation, under marginal and difficult circumstances, with toxic substances, etc. But actually, to continue the analogy, if we want to understand the meaning of a given painting for an artist, the range of circumstances of artists, the cultural context today for artistic life, and the lived experience of a given artist, we know in our heart of hearts that we would need to go much deeper. I can tell you that my experiences as a frequent client point to an extremely wide range of circumstances, work environments for sex work, and individual situations. And in fairness to an inherent diversity that can only be appreciated with some awareness of several levels of context, we're going to need to take a big step back in this series and reflect carefully on some of our own cultural context and on the many categories that we're dealing with here. We need to stay grounded empirically and stay open to the potential plurality of our subject. Above all, like anthropologists in the field, we need to avoid premature moral panic. This is not to argue against more specific analysis, criteria, generalizations, and assessments about sex work in the proposed legislation. We'll absolutely get to that in this series. But let's try together to move our understanding well along before we begin to evaluate. At a high level, I've got three major objectives for this series. First, I want to point to broader perspectives on casual sex, and especially paid sexual services in the modern world. Second, to acknowledge deeply troubling aspects of some sex work environments, and also the limits of current knowledge. And finally, to challenge the proposed Canadian legislation as self-defeating vis-a-vis its only legitimate purpose, and also profoundly illiberal. I do want to dedicate this series. This series will succeed or fail based only on the quality of the empirical and theoretical argumentation. Still, what has motivated me in this series has been the memories of the many wonderful experiences I've shared with people you might primarily think of as sex workers, but for me are primarily outstanding people. And so, to all the women I've had the immense privilege to meet, your grace, your generosity of spirit, your good humor, your resilience, and your playfulness never cease to amaze. My daily existence wouldn't be the same without you, and I dedicate this series of presentations to your honor. Thank you, and I will hope to see all of you in part 2 of this series.